And the lies and crimes of 9/11 are calculated to create Islamophobia. I want to hear Dick Cheney on the stand. I want to hear his defense. 9/11 has been reified and manufactured as a religious fable, and it has become central to the national religion of the United States. And I believe Islam has a big part of Western civilization. And the expansionary impulse of the American empire is very deeply rooted in the Indian Wars. Stephen Harper, our Prime Minister, I have a problem with the fact that he seems more loyal to the sovereignty and interests of the Israeli government than the Canadian government. Honestly, I have a problem with that.
He's come all the way from Canada. If you were in the Grand Lake Theatre on Thursday, you met him. His name is Professor Anthony J. Hall. And I must say, I was just so excited when his voice appeared on the scene a few years ago, because he's a very powerful voice in Canada amongst the intelligentsia, the peace movement. And we have his books out there on the table, and they're just incredibly heavy books. This is Earth into Property, and I have read the whole thing. And he also did another one. It's called The American Empire and the Fourth World. And Naomi Klein writes, if people read this book, it would change the world. And I believe it's true. It's just that it's hard to get people to sit down and read for 5 days or 6 days to get through Anthony's books. But we're hoping that he's going to be able to condense all the knowledge that he has into a speech that's less than 5 or 6 days long. and he's also, he's a really special person too. He's been out on the front lines as an activist, helping in the Indigenous struggles in Canada. He was also with Splitting the Sky, when Splitting the Sky attempted an arrest of George Bush in Canada, and they're going to try again, because Bush has the chutzpah, believe it or not, to try to go back to Canada. And so there's a lot of people who believe that you shouldn't allow people who have committed torture, who admittedly committed torture and all these other crimes to travel internationally. And I think it's a very worthy effort. And he also has written extensively too on what's happening with Fukushima, and he's spoken out about nuclear issues too. And that's what I like about Tony, is he looks at the much larger picture. So his book includes 9/11, but it's a piece of this much larger process of corporate globalization, which I think we're all against, of empire. Sherry?
In fact, I wanted to just read you just a little bit. I just opened to a page because it's so huge, and this is what it says. For democracy to function properly, those who run networks of communications must be invested with sufficient honesty and integrity to make sure that media coverage of the human condition is sufficiently balanced and truthful to enable citizens to make informed political decisions. But what happens when the truth becomes a threat or an impediment to the exercise of power by these ruling elites? Will facsimiles of truth, call them pseudo-truths, be fabricated as an expedient of public relations? Will distortions, disinformation, or diversions be concocted to steer public attention away from those facets of reality that call into question the very legitimacy of the most fundamental relationships of power and social control? To those who direct the operations of the national security state, the answer to questions such as these has often been a resounding yes. I find that very inspiring, don't you? Please welcome him all the way from Toronto, Canada, Professor Anthony Hall.
As the Ojibwe say, miigwech. Thank you. This is the first time I've spoken in the United States of America. And when I learned that I would be coming to the place where the UN Charter was formulated and signed in 1945, it was pretentious. It filled me with hope, because the UN was founded in this town with the aspiration of abolishing war for all time. And I see the 9/11 Truth Movement as at the very avant-garde of the anti-war movement, because you can't deal with the politics of the 9/11 wars without dealing with the origins of the 9/11 wars and how it happened. So, yes, I'd like a little information on that. So we are at the avant-garde of the anti-war movement, the 9/11 Truth Movement. Now, as so-called truthers, and I take that, I am embracing that term. I embrace the heritage of the Enlightenment, of rationality, of Voltaire. I don't like to live in an era where superstitions and the priestcraft rule us with this fear, with this imagery of Islamic devils in caves planning diabolical events. I want to get back to the heritage of the Enlightenment. As truthers, we face questions. So let's just put a few of these very basic questions out. Now, I did prepare a paper, a written presentation, and it's called When War is Promoted as a Remedy for Terror. So if you want to Google that title, When War is Promoted as a Remedy for Terror, of course, what an absurdity to fight war as a remedy to terror. Right there's an enormous lie embedded in the propaganda, in the advertising, the public relations of what is at the core of the political economy of the world superpower, the ailing superpower. So I am free-forming. I want to speak from the heart, and I did write it all out. I know you can get a degree of distilled and concentrated information when you write it ahead of time, but on the other hand, something about the spontaneous presentation, when it's coming from the heart, when you know I'm writing this, I'm conceiving this, I have a plan, but that's where I'm at. So I think right up front, I put out questions that we face all the time. For instance, like, well, say you do persuade society that the story was concocted that was given out within a few hours of 9/11. Say you do establish it, then what? Do you have any plan? And I think that's a very good question. And as I'm coming to see it, the exposure of the lies and crimes of 9/11 cut so deeply, they so discredit such a sweep of the ruling class, that there is something profoundly subversive and revolutionary in our movement. And I think we need to talk about I think we've actually done it. I think the hard work has actually happened. When I go to conferences with learned professors and whatnot, when I'm with people who are opportunists, careerists, want cracks on mainstream media, want government contracts, you're not going to get that by exploring these issues of what really happened on 9/11. So it's not a good career move to go into this area. And I was glad to see the university politics, the academic politics that Professor Stephen Jones has faced on his campus and that I face on my campus when, for instance, Jonathan Kay attacks my graduate student when he gets a small scholarship, $7,000, Joshua Blakeney, to study 9/11 skepticism, the origins of the 9/11 wars. And we're attacked in Canada by the most powerful press machinery in the country. But my administration is holding with me. And so we can do this in the curriculum, and we're developing this in the curriculum. I'm not emeritus. I'm teaching on Wednesday night. So I'm taking responsibility for this. What are the other questions? Anybody think there's another basic question that comes up when you say, well, I'm pursuing 9/11 truth? Why? Like you run into, well, look, there's famine, poverty, financial debacles, war, every kind of rape and pillage all over the planet. Why would you take this one issue when there's so many other important issues? Well, I think those of us who've come to the conclusion that we put our emphasis here understand, look, we're lied to all the time. We know that. As children, we had to figure it out very early in life. You're just lied to on the media all the time. So what's the big deal? So there's some lies involved here. I think there's an understanding among us that this particular category of lies, this complex of lies, is so audacious. It's so diabolical. It's so comprehensive, and it's not rocket science to look at Building 7 and say that's a controlled demolition. We can argue about, was it nanothermite, was it this or that, but the larger picture, NORAD, what is the history of Al-Qaeda, what happened at the Pentagon, why was Bush in the bunker and was Cheney in the bunker and Bush in Florida, on and on and on. There's not one element of the official story that really stands up. So we have come to the conclusion that we're not going to let this category of lies go past us. And I think we can give ourselves a hand. And we will stand together, and we will protect each other, and we will watch each other's backs. Because there is a certain danger right now, and that is such a horrible commentary on the violation of the principles of the UN Charter, that what happened here in 1945, the principles of common decency, the principles of the rule of law. Pardon? Yes, of course, fine. Many will deal with the outgrowths of the fraud, of the big lie of 9/11, but you've got to go to the origins. You've got to deal with how did it happen. So this is this project, of which Earth into Property is the second volume. This is the first volume, and Naomi Klein blurbed it. The cover got an award. This is a fantastic cover as well, Earth into Property. On the cover here are helicopters where the stars are. What? Yes, on the microphone. And these helicopters might be called Black Hawk or Apache. And of course, the most famous Apache was Geronimo. And when Geronimo was the code name given to bin Laden, or the impersonator of bin Laden, or the faux bin Laden, that was very significant. Prescott Bush took Geronimo's, he robbed the grave in 1918 and literally took the skull to the Skull and Bones Club. So that naming of bin Laden, Geronimo, that's what I start the paper that I wrote for this presentation with. So this text here, the cover, the reality that indigenous peoples in North America who fought the expansion of the American empire and the transcontinental expansion of the United States of America is an imperial land grab, and it was genocidal. And ironically, those who opposed and fought it, like for instance Black Hawk, who was an Indian man in the Illinois area, he has a weapon named after him, a helicopter named after him, the Apache helicopter. Of course, Geronimo was in the custody of the United States of America for much of his life, for decades, and the United States could never say, is he a domestic prisoner who broke the laws of the United States, or is he an international prisoner? Is he a prisoner of war? And so the issues that come up in Guantanamo are very old in the history of this country. And the expansionary impulse of the American empire is very deeply rooted in the Indian Wars. So, as I was doing the introduction for the first volume of The American Empire in the Fourth World, or it's called The American Empire in the Fourth World, the two volumes together are bowl with one spoon. The invasion of Iraq was just starting, and it was 2003. And I said, well, that's an extension of the story I've been telling. Much of my history as a professor of Native American Studies. It was actually the 7th Cavalry charging towards Baghdad. It's the 7th Cavalry that was defeated by Sitting Bull. And it's the 7th Cavalry that got its revenge at Wounded Knee in 1890, and many of you will have read, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. So I said, well, I'm writing about this invasion. It had just happened, and I think this part stands up pretty well. Between when I wrote it and then the opportunity to revise it, I saw this amazing ceremony, mission accomplished, recall that, on the Abraham Lincoln. And it wasn't accidental that it took place on the Abraham Lincoln, because when I went through the script, there was a reference to releasing the Iraqis from enslavement. There was a reference to the Gettysburg Address by the Iraqis, for the Iraqis, of the Iraqis. So this was a psyop. This was an advertising campaign for the military-industrial complex, actually comparing the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent illegal occupation to the freeing of the slaves, to Abraham Lincoln's freeing of the slaves. Remember, George Bush landed on the Abraham Lincoln on the deck? Very much like Triumph of the Will begins with Adolf Hitler coming down from the skies to the Nuremberg rally in 1934. Very much like the film Independence Day, where the President of the United States is actually in a jet fighter plane opposing the aliens. And it became increasingly clear to me that this was not accidental, this was not coincidental, this was a highly manufactured piece of military propaganda, and they were drawing on the masters of propaganda in Hollywood, in Nuremberg. And that's going to be the subject tonight that I want to deal with. The nature of the psyop that we're dealing with, the psychological operation. And of course, that is the deepest sort of science and technology of this country, going back to Edward Bernays, the Crook Commission, studying how you affect public opinion, how you advertise, not only products, but presidents, political campaigns. And of course, we know that war is the most lucrative contract for the Madison Avenue so-called PR companies, which are really propaganda companies. Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud and a student of the subconscious and the manipulation of public opinion, after Goebbels liked his book, and Goebbels was the minister of propaganda, he came up with this term, public relations. Much of the crimes of our time take place in these public relations agencies, where today, I'm sure, how many billions went out to public relations agencies for the events today to plant in our minds this fear of Arab and Muslim people, this poison, toxic mind pollution that causes hatred among ourselves, that gives justification to the war machine, so that when you blast in white phosphorus, depleted uranium to destroy whole populations, genetic constitution forever, for all times. When you send in drones, the robotic madness and corruption and horrible, the idea that that nobody actually is taking direct responsibility. It's all being done by robots. So, the robotization of the military in the United States, huge implications around that. None of this could happen if you didn't dehumanize the populations, the children, the women, the elders, the civilians who are receiving this destruction. So we know with the Reichstag fire, we can look back at the Holocaust, we can see the propaganda techniques to dehumanize Jews, to prepare for that horrific event we call the Holocaust. So I'm going to read a short element of this from the preface of American Empire in the Fourth World. In May 2003, the Bush White House shortened the name of the war on terrorism to the War on Terror. It thereby highlighted the sharp internal contradiction within the phrase. War is, after all, a concentrated form of terror. The semantic adjustment was introduced in the course of a military victory ceremony on board a U.S. aircraft. The Battle of Iraq, declared President George Bush from the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, is one victory in the war on terror that began on September 11th, 2001. Bush's speech was delivered amidst an event that was pure American showmanship, a finely honed spectacle of political propaganda designed to generate those kinds of images that belong more to the realm of mythology than to articulate argument. In an era when software, public relations, and celebrity have become the central currencies in the political economy of mass illusion, the event was a textbook example of artful advertising for the military-industrial complex. It served to help illustrate that the most consequential conflicts of our time are not those fought with the weaponry of physical violence, but with the means of manipulating public opinion. And when I wrote my 11,000-word essay reviewing Jonathan Kay's Among the Truthers, the Birthers, those who, the Hollywood know-nothings, this guilt by association, well-known propaganda technique, I've really been increasingly struck by the fact that 9/11 has been reified and manufactured as a religious fable, and it has become central to the national religion of the United States, and that has been done consciously, so we can't have a rational argument about what happened then. It's like trying to argue Christianity with a devout Christian. I mean, and David Ray Griffin was early on to it. You must see, if you haven't seen it, the YouTube of George Bush 3 days after 9/11 declaring war and Al-Qaeda literally from the pulpit in a church in Washington, D.C. He is declaring religious war. This is constructed as a religious war. And so I've been thinking about the PSYOP, and I think we have to go there. We have to deal with that. I keep imagining this moment on Madison Avenue or wherever it was, Tel Aviv, wherever it was, where there was the view, well, we've got these towers. They're filled with asbestos. They're white elephants. If we took down those towers on live national TV, that would have such a cataclysmic effect that would so traumatize people, it would give a license to do pretty much anything, and that's what's happened. And I can't say such a meeting took place, but I'm beginning to suspect such a meeting took place. Who was there? Was Michael Shermer there? Was he part of that discussion? Methinks he does protest too loudly. And as I look at this psychological operation, the more I see its essence is this. Its purpose is to demonize generically, collectively, Arab and Muslim people. It is to create the mental environment for wars which can be presented to some constituencies like born-again Christians as religious wars, as returns to the Crusades, as crusades against infidels. And the central meme of this, Al-Qaeda is meant to be this embodiment of the Islamic enemy, the extremes of Islamic intolerance. And the structure of it is that we are to be conceiving Western civilization as a Judeo-Christian heritage and to black out the Muslim facet of Western civilization. And I believe Islam has a big part of Western civilization, whether we talk about zeros, whether we go to the history of Andalusia. We have to fight, what is a tremendous, horrific crime up there with any crime that happened, Third Reich. To contaminate a population, like, for instance, the Reichstag fire with small potatoes compared to 9/11. To plant the meme that Jews are communists and that it's going to be okay to put people in camps, to eliminate people. We've had that experience, and that is going on in our midst. And the lies of 9/11, the lies and crimes of 9/11 are calculated to create Islamophobia. And the cover-up, which our friends and family, in the universities, working in the mainstream media. We know many people involved in this cover-up. And they've been so traumatized and propagandized that they may not realize. But I think we have to call our friends and neighbors and relatives who are feeding Islamophobia as a prelude to mass murder and torture. And this brings me to, the hard reality, well, who did it? 10 years later, it's kind of hard. How many times have I gone through the discussion with people? They tell me, well, then who did it? Like Shermer yells at me at the University of Lethbridge. I'm saying, David Ray Griffin, you come from Claremont. Have you read David Ray Griffin's books? He yells at me, well, who did it? As if somehow, unless, you phone the police, you say that a murder has happened in your home, and the policeman answers back, well, who did it? Well, you're the police. Well, tell me who did it. Well, come and investigate. Well, who did it? And unless I could, he has the microphone, in 20 seconds produce a credible whodunit. No, that it's very valid. Richard Gage's approach, very valid, saying we're not going there. All we have to do is demonstrate that the official story is incorrect. Then, the officials have to go through the process. But it's hard to hold yourself back from whodunit. And a very good question was asked. If we can't deal with that, where does that leave us? How am I doing for time? Yeah. I'm enjoying myself. Thank you. What a pleasure to be speaking to this audience on this subject. Thank you. So my graduate student, Joshua Blakeney, he is on the case of the neocons, of PNAC, of the split in the U.S. policy structure, where a group largely representing certain plans centered in Israel took over in the Bush regime and became very influential. And of course, we know PNAC. I don't have to say to this audience what PNAC is. We need a new Pearl Harbor to catalyze public opinion, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a tough subject. It's a tough subject in the truth movement. Joshua takes a lot of hits for it. I have been very shy to go there. But thanks to my graduate student's efforts, he has pointed out to me in the 1970s, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now the Prime Minister of Israel, and who, of course, comes from the Likud aspect or heritage of Israeli political tradition. And of course, Likud has heritage in Irgun, the Stern Gang, one of the major terrorist episodes of all time in 1946, blowing up the King David Hotel, which was the place where the British had their Palestinian Mandate government centered. And so that's where Benjamin Netanyahu is coming from. His brother Jonathan is a very famous war hero, went into Entebbe, and he does represent the hard line of, and the heritage of the will to a greater Israel. And in the 1970s, late 1970s, Benjamin Netanyahu was front and center in organizing conferences, specifically a conference in Jerusalem. And it's published in 1979. And I'm looking at the footnotes of my article, When War is Promoted as a Remedy for Terror, the article that I wrote for this presentation here. And you'll see here a reference, and there's some copies out front, along with my book, Proceedings of the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, held under the auspices of the Jonathan Institution. Jonathan is Netanyahu's, Benjamin's brother, July 2 to 5th, 1979. And then those conference papers are kind of updated, and Netanyahu himself publishes in 1986, Terrorism, How the West Can Win, Terrorism. So imagine the sort of stretch, the intellectual stretch, to invent this concept that somehow violence, when it happens, can be identified, unless it's coming from the governments, from the states, from the military-industrial complex, from the companies that actually do the legwork on this military work. Imagine inventing that whole category of human affairs and calling it terrorism. Of course, Mandela, for the ANC, who was head of the military wing of the ANC, that's a terrorist. The founders of the United States, I come from Canada, I'm not wearing a red coat for nothing. And the redcoats were actually had a quite, it wasn't altruistic, it was self-serving, but they befriended the Indians, married the Indians. Tecumseh fought the United States in alliance with the British authority. So imagine, so there, the United States, I said it, is founded on what would today be defined as terrorism. People were taking up arms to fight the duly constituted authority of King George III. King George III's descendants, Queen Elizabeth, is my queen. And I have no problem with Queen Elizabeth. She doesn't push us around very much. She's actually minds her own business. Who I do have a problem with is Stephen Harper, our Prime Minister. I have a problem with the fact that he seems more loyal to the sovereignty and interests of the Israeli government than the Canadian government. Honestly, I have a problem with that. So the identification of all of this as terrorism, and then he writes this book, Terrorism, Netanyahu, How the West Can Win. Well, the West, what is the West? I mean, in California, I guess this is kind of the West. I live in Alberta on the eastern slopes of the Rockies. I mean, this is a kind of fiction, the West. But the West, I embrace a lot of good things in the West. I'm proud of that heritage in some ways. The overcoming of slavery, the universal franchise, labor rights. The West is a complex organism, and I certainly want the West, my West, the West to embrace its Islamic heritage. And I certainly reject the propaganda of the perpetrators of the lies and crimes of 9/11 who did that act to demonize Arab and Muslim people and create the mental environment for Islamophobia, for genocide. Fuck you! Fuck you! We are going after you, and when I talk about, well, where is the 9/11 truth movement headed? We need to go through trials. And that's how I see what's happening in Toronto. And those are my friends who organize that. Professor McQueen, Barry's vicar, has organized another event because there's controversy about the Pentagon. And Sunday night, tonight, Barry is hosting his own event with CIT to get out that point of view on the Pentagon. So these are, this, to my way of thinking, is the central psyop. The nature of the psyop is to invent Al-Qaeda, the military-industrial complex, the permanent war economy, military Keynesianism. After the demise of the Soviet Union, you needed a new enemy to keep this, this parasitical, to give a new life to the war machine. The war machine, of course, thrives on death. And you needed a new enemy. So Al-Qaeda is the new enemy. We know where it comes from. We know how manufactured it is. How many times is that word Al-Qaeda going out from all these university experts and whatnot who get huge grants at the universities, who are dominating our mainstream media. You are going to be subject to our accusations that you are conducting the psychological aspect of war crimes, which in my point of view is the most serious. Once you start shooting the missiles and such, the dirty work is already done. And the dirty work is on our nightly news. And the dirty work is in our papers. And that's what we need to. I want to hear Dick Cheney on the stand. I want to hear his defense. I want him to have the best lawyer. And I bet you his defense is 9/11. Oh no, we weren't, all these crimes, we had to do it because we had to protect our own people from Al-Qaeda. And that's anti-war movement, why we have to get to the bottom of what happened on 9/11. We can't just nicely evade that topic. And I've got an opportunity for a little Q&A. But I'd like to finish with some text from Earth into Property. And I include in this a history of the 9/11 truth movement. I include the organizational form and intellectual approach of the 9/11 truth movement began to coalesce at early conferences such as those conceived and planned by Nicholas Levy in Berlin, Carol Bouillet in San Francisco, Barry Zwicker and Ian Woods in Toronto. I wanted to get that in. Carol Bouillet, I want to thank her. She's been a great support, and I just have a list of questions. You're familiar with these questions, but the questions not addressed, and not addressing these questions which we've been asking in a serious way is, in my way, highly criminal, highly criminal. How could the impact of 2 jet crashes have caused the complete obliteration of 3 steel-frame towers? How was it that all 3 structures plunged into their own footprint through the path of maximum resistance, roughly at the speed of free falls, in events displaying all the classic characteristics of controlled demolitions? What was the source of the massive amount of energy required to vaporize and pulverize the largest of the World Trade Centers into huge billows of toxic gases and talcum powder-like dust? How could it be that the alleged hijacker, Mohammed Atta's passport, miraculously survived the debacle to be found in pristine condition at Ground Zero, whereas the black box cockpit voice recorders and data recorders from the 2 airliners were never recovered? I haven't seen that asked, but I'm asking that. That came to me as I was working on this list of questions. Atta's passport survives, but the black boxes don't? How interesting. How could 19 Saudi men, said to be armed with nothing but box cutters, a smattering of flight training, and intense jihadist zeal, cut through every element of the world's most elaborate intelligence and defense apparatus in order to hit their targets? Carrying on, why did the whole system of North American air defense fail so spectacularly on that day? If the events of 9/11 really did include an enormous failure in the operations of the military-industrial complex, why was it that not one official in the whole chain of command was fired for negligence, malfeasance? Why? Why is nobody fired? Why has nobody resigned? Why was FEMA, the Federal Emergency Agency, in such a hurry to cart away and dispose of the major physical evidence at the crime scene? How can President Bush's peculiar actions throughout the day of 9/11 be explained? Why did Vice President Richard Cheney enter the White House bunker to take control of the national security state's response to the attacks in the morning of September 11, 2001? I damn well want an answer to that. Why was Cheney in the bunker and Bush in Florida? What orders did he give? What did Dick Cheney preempt the power of the President of the United States on the morning of September 11th? I want an answer to that. What kind of flying machine was it that made such a deep but narrow penetration of the Pentagon's thick walls? And why has the U.S. government not released its own extensive video records of the event? I want an answer. Why was the supposed crash site of Flight 93 in Pennsylvania so bereft of physical records? Who had the means to plan, coordinate, and execute all facets of the international crimes committed on September 11th? Al-Qaeda, dudes in caves with flashlights? Who had the motives? Who had the means? Who benefited? Okay, that's it.
Professor Anthony Hall, you have questions? I bet you do. He's got questions.
Thank you.
I would like to add another question, and that is, why is it that Donald Rumsfeld came out on September 10th and say that $3 trillion was unaccounted for at the Pentagon, and the very next day accountants were killed at the Pentagon who are trying to find out what happened to that money, while Dov Zakim, an Israeli citizen, was in charge, controller of that Pentagon money finances.
Very great question. And I'll just answer the question with a little anecdote. It was Splitting the Sky, the Attica brother who attempted a citizen's arrest of George W. Bush in Calgary in 2009. He speaks in my class often. And this particular time, I came to pick him up at Chase, BC. It's like a 10-hour drive to Lethbridge from there. And he started talking about 9/11, and he said he wanted to lecture on that subject. And I had a kind of sense of being, a sense of guilt. I, at that point, was sort of blowback theory. Finally, the colonized people got theirs in. But I felt obliged to spend a couple of days and research it. And to tell the truth, when I came across that CBS YouTube with Donald Rumsfeld in the Pentagon on what day, September the 10th, if you wanted a story to get covered up and you knew something, now this isn't evidence, it's circumstantial, but how coincidental that he announces, and this was in the days when a trillion was still a trillion, you know. You didn't hear a trillion that often. The derivatives were at, you know, in 2007, first time I heard the number quadrillion, 1.14 quadrillion of derivatives out there. And what does that portend for the future? But that really was the moment where it turned for me, where it just said, look, September the 10th, very few people have heard of this. Because, of course, the next day there was another big story that blew away all the other news. So it's a good question. Whether or not it's true that the accountants who were on that were where the missile hit, you know, that's something I've heard of whether or not it's true. So much of, you know, you really have to be careful about just taking hearsay. Okay.
We have another question.
And of course, Building 7, what was in it? All of the security apparatus, all of the national security state, including, you know, emergency measures in floor 23, where Giuliani was, and that was his thing. You know, it's an attractive picture, or not attractive, but you can't dismiss it to think, was that the control room where the thing was done out of there? When the Israeli group who supposedly filmed it were pointing a camera at the first one, was that a camera or was that a laser? And if you know about the way projectiles can be attracted to lasers, you know, that's a question that I hope Joshua runs down in his MA thesis.
It's a perfect prelude to my question, actually. That's why I stood up. What I'm my name is Ellison Horn. I'm an independent video producer here in San Francisco, and here with Gene Morris to help develop a Veterans Resource Center, Media Center here in the building. Building 7, what I remember reading a long time ago is that there had been exercises, disaster preparedness exercises, which is why the building was not fully operational at the time. That was supposed to
you know,
take place
Tarpley
that
has a
morning.
list of 43 exercises happening that day. 43. So, of course, the people on NORAD and looking at all these screens were dealing with exercises. So, so it was confusing. And this gets to the question of, well, you know, look, if it was an inside job, like so many people would have to know. Well, you know, who designed all those exercises? And then you can confuse a lot of people by, you know, command and control. Yeah,
I mean, this is the command center, the new one, right? Wasn't it?
And then the other exercise, you know, FEMA is in there for exercise like the day before. And then FEMA is very early on carting away the steel. And taking the steel off to become a Chinese battleship or whatever it is now.
And the last thing related to that that I remember reading was how Cheney, apparently there's records that show that Cheney had actually made a number of visits to that building.
Well, I'll just finish by saying Cheney made a visit to my province where the tar sands are. Dick Cheney flew over the tar sands, and I'm in Alberta, and you can be sure that I'm holding that turf. It's a lot of Mormons in Alberta. Stephen Jones is a Mormon. We see what happened at Brigham Young University, but I'm in the saddle. I'm going into class on Wednesday night, and I'll be able to talk about my moment here in San Francisco at the place where the UN was founded. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Professor, thank you so much. Anthony Hall.